The Lord of the Rings is an epic fantasy adventure that warns its readers/viewers about the dangers of industrialization and the rise of technology and science. These books were written in a postmodern world after the wake of World War II, and we're still feeling direct impacts from these advancements in the 21st century. There are distinct races that each stand for different ways of life, some simpler, some with a higher purpose, but they're all built around community, meaning, and beauty in life. Even the elves, who take advantage of technology and sciences, only do so in service of ascending to their ultimate destination in life. It's not merely the existence of technology and science that is evil, but it's when it becomes the substitute for religion, beauty, and natural orders that all goodness is sucked from the face of the world. It's an irreplicable miracle that the Lord of the Rings films were able to capture and re-exemplify these themes. It could have only been through an unjaded, youthful, and passionate filmmaker like Peter Jackson. Even his work following this trilogy has fallen off, showing that it was truly a lightning-in-a-bottle moment to have been gifted these amazing films. Seeing as Lord of the Rings is anti-industrialist, it's ironic that Amazon, one of the biggest corporations to grace the earth at this point, is heading this new series. I'm very passionate about Lord of the Rings, and clearly I just set the stage to hate the Rings of Power. But do you want to know something? Everything that I just read was from the beginning of a script that I wrote before I even watched the show. I didn't have a full script pre-written or anything like that, but based off the trailers and the buzz around the show, I had written down some pre-established assumptions that this show would completely bastardize Lord of the Rings, but for the most part, it does not. The Rings of Power is trying very hard to respect the source material that they have just poured so much money into. The show isn't really offensive to me at this point. However, the show shoots itself in the foot by existing in the first place. It sits in a terrible world where it neither dares to be too similar nor different enough from the original trilogy, and it suffers for it. Let me explain. The Rings of Power is set thousands of years before the Lord of the Rings trilogy and follows an assortment of characters as they all gather to confront the re-emergence of an evil threat within Middle-earth. The first two episodes just premiered and I watched them, so this video is only an assessment of the starting point of the show. I have only seen as much as the rest of you. To get this out of the way, I do not have a problem with adaptations deviating from the original source material if they have something worthwhile to offer. I definitely have a soft spot for the series, especially considering that The Fellowship of the Ring was the first movie I ever saw, but I'm not a blind defender of the authenticity of Lord of the Rings. Both The Shining and 2001: A Space Odyssey jump to mind as examples of movies that vastly deviate from the books which they're based on, but they chart a new path and offer something of their own to the viewers, while merely taking inspiration and some world building from the original. This is not what The Rings of Power does, however. Have you ever considered the reason a story is told from a certain character's perspective? Why Frodo in Lord of the Rings? What if the main character was Aragorn? Or why not Gimli, for instance? We're cast into the story inside the shoes of Frodo because he is a character who has only ever known the Shire, a tight-knit community that will be instantly recognizable and relatable, if not a tad fantastical. We learn of the world with him, which makes us both wonder and fear with him. This gives us the opportunity to grow an organic story, where even learning opportunities feels necessary for survival in this wide world rather than obligatory exposition dumps. The Rings of Power strips us away from this youthful lead and lets us meet a collection of adult characters, except for one which I will address soon. And because of this, the magic of the world is stripped away. Without fail, almost every single scene where Elrond speaks, he starts the statement with, "They say," as an attempt to justify this exposition that everyone in the room should already understand. They don't take into account the context of who is speaking. Now pause. Do not misunderstand me. The Rings of Power doesn't simply stumble because of clunky exposition. It stumbles because of a consistent insistence to misunderstand the reasons the core DNA of The Lord of the Rings works so well. As a new story, it's necessary to stand its own ground and offer something valuable, but in fear of being too much like the trilogy, it makes differentiating decisions that only hurts itself because all of the decisions in Lord of the Rings are so strong. Let me make some comparisons between the two. Cinematic language. This is probably one of the easiest aspects for everyone to understand. We all know Lord of the Rings is defined by sweeping helicopter shots during pilgrimages, epic scale battles, horrifying inserts, and intimate conversations in between staged in elaborate sets. The Rings of Power has the money to achieve all of these things, and it looks better than I initially expected it would. But the missing factor is that these elements are used out of obligation rather than out of motivation. The sweeping helicopter shots were not used in the earlier parts of the Fellowship of the Ring when Frodo knew nothing of the world and lived with his uncle. They were used when the Fellowship set out on a world-spanning adventure. In the Rings of Power, these shots are used when a character is simply leaving their house, going on a walk, or picking berries. It misunderstands the DNA. It doesn't know when to use these shots effectively to communicate emotion. It just uses them because Lord of the Rings has done that previously. Character motivations. I said I would address this youthful character. Now tell me, is it more interesting to focus around a character who has an adventure imposed upon their peaceful life and is forced to reconcile with that? Or is it more interesting to focus on a character who wants more than their peaceful life and then has more literally fall out of the sky in front of them, much to their liking? If you're saying this one, you're lying to yourself. Let's be honest. Many of the character motivations are inverted or boiled down in an attempt to be different, just like this character is trying to separate themselves from Frodo. But in doing so, it simply makes it inherently less interesting and more stereotypical. This show is very tropey and is kind of dull because of that at times. There are also characters who are just uncannily similar to others, like at this point, the border guards seeming like a less layered version of Strider. Music, transitions, and tone. Peter Jackson did not directly make every edit, compose the music, make the sound design, film every shot, etc. What he did do, though, was guide the entire experience into a cohesive whole that prospered the creativity of each individual to complement each other. The composer is the same between the movies and the show, but the music is infinitely weaker in the show. 2 episodes in, there's not a single memorable theme, but only random orchestration throughout to set the mood. The best thing that I can point to for this is a lack of strong leadership. Anytime a sense of danger or darkness is detected in the slightest, a theme reminiscent to the caverns of Isengard starts humming away. Jackson had the knowledge to know when to simply allow silence to fill the room. He gave the themes their time and place, their meaning. He prospered the creativity into a vision. Same with the transitions. In the Rings of Power, many moments don't flow well into the next for the same reasons. Jackson had a history in horror movies, and he was able to use that to capitalize on the horrors of Mordor. The show tries to replicate the jump scares and the quick inserts, but it does them far less effectively. Almost every single feeling is less effective in the show because of less capable hands, and I haven't seen them try to offer their own tone yet. This is a replication attempt from a machine. I'm not trying to just batter any of these 3 directors, but I really don't see a cohesive vision coming through. Structure. Both the Fellowship of the Ring and the Rings of Power begin similarly, with a history lesson narrated by Galadriel. In the Fellowship, this carries into the journey of Frodo. In the Rings of Power, we begin rapidly cutting between various characters to show each of their starting points. This ties back into not having a protagonist we can learn through. There's never enough time to get connected to any of their characters, and it feels like an anthology, even though they will all obviously tie in together eventually. Diversification. Based upon the landscape of the modern political world, Amazon made the decision to diversify the cast of characters through each race. This was a binary decision that was not considering the source material, which so specifically draws contrasts and ideas through its strict divisions between races and sects of peoples. Not only are these conflicting ideals on the surface, but the show still introduces race politics. If they were simply cutting out all the cultural distinctions in the world by means to be diverse, that would be a different direction and introduces new ideas. But they are definitely not doing that. So not even is it just in contrast to the source material, but even upon itself. This content is hypocritical. The world of Middle-earth simply does not function in its intended purpose by muddying the water between these races, and this is an area where we can see the clear misunderstanding of the source material, while simultaneously refusing to stand apart from Amazon. While in actuality this is more of an annoyance to me than it is a massive deal, it does strip away the visual distinctiveness between the various locations, so it all becomes one big blur that is far less appealing to me. I love visual distinction between acts, which is found in the different locations and people groups in Lord of the Rings, but here you really have to pay attention to see if they have pointy ears or hairy feet to be able to tell who they are and who they side with. Every single one of these decisions make the story weaker than what Lord of the Rings already was, which is why at this point in time I think the story needed to be something completely different or not exist in the first place. We're going to take a sudden turn now to talk about the other major element I'm conflicted with, the pacing. It's hard to hold a well-rounded opinion yet because I'm going off only a slice of the story. In my favorite pilot episodes, the protagonist goes through a dramatic, inciting incident that changes them into the main character of the show. In Breaking Bad, Walter White gets cancer, so he turns from school teacher to meth cook to provide for his family in the short time he has. In The Boys, Huey's mundane existence is shattered when a superhero who he previously adored kills his girlfriend. This puts him on a path to destroy those whom he had previously worshipped and compels him to make something of his life. In the Rings of Power, each character has a very basic goal or desire. They each push forward with these goals in the anthology-esque plotting, but there is no conflict that challenges this in a way that changes them yet. Each character is still exactly the same as when we met them, a quarter of the way through the season. I'm a fan of fast-paced television because I don't really like filler. I'm okay with a slow burn as long as it still makes advancements, even if subtle character changes throughout. But much of the Rings of Power has me worried it's just filler to drag the story out over 5 seasons. My verdict is reserved on this topic because I haven't seen the whole first season, but I do expect significant arcs to be set up and resolved in a story. Thus far, the structures of each episode have not been satisfying as episodes. They feel more like the pacing of an overly drawn-out movie. There are definitely themes being set up, and I could see that after the 5 seasons, people will find it a very worthwhile story. But I'm afraid that the satisfaction may only be found in the collective 5 seasons, rather than in each season. Each movie is structured well and is satisfying in its own right, while feeding into a greater whole. I am not so sure that the show will accomplish this the same, but we'll see. In the end, some stories just need to be left alone, I think. Even though rich with history, the history has been presented in the way it was with the detail it was for a reason. When trying to flesh it out, it takes away from the mystery and makes it less interesting. Take The Hobbit as an example. Even though from the hands of Peter Jackson, when he started introducing new ideas of his own into it to stretch it out, it became clear that it was a bad idea and that The Hobbit functions more effectively as a short, self-contained book rather than an epic trilogy. J.R.R. Tolkien knew what he was writing and why he was writing it in the way that he was. The tale of this show could have still become worthwhile, but I'm partially apprehensive about this in the premiere. For all the railing, I do have to re-express the fact that this show is perfectly watchable and it's not offensive. Many people will love this, but really the show just makes me wish I were watching the movies. I have a bad feeling that it's going to take many seasons for this to become a worthwhile story. The show is having a hard time proving to me that any of its decisions are well thought out so far. I'll return with a full analysis of Season 1 once the entire thing is aired. If you enjoyed the video, leave it a like and subscribe. If you thought it could have been better though, leave it a thumbs down so that I know to do better next time. Thanks guys, I'll see you later.